with the Liberty Movement from the university up until the present. I currently live in Fort Collins, where I work as a political operative for a gun lobby, and I also do a lot of writing on the side for sites like Mises Institute. I've been published as well on Zero Hedge and Business Insider. Justin, could you get the next slide? As y'all know, the current situation in Venezuela is very complicated. You see a lot of media portrayals of the whole crisis. The toilet paper shortages, long lines, scarcity of basic goods, riots on the street, soaring crime rates, you name it. Unfortunately, the analysis provided by the media is rather simplistic and sometimes just completely misses the mark, does not acknowledge what the underlying cause behind all this is, and it's socialism. But as a historian, I still think even the conservative angles to this are slightly inaccurate and very simplistic as well. So there is a historical perspective that we need, and I argue that this crisis is 50 years in the making. Next slide. To understand the whole Venezuelan crisis, we have to understand the origins of Venezuela as a country. It gained its independence from Spain in 1821 and was a complete economic backwater for most of its history. It was a coffee-based economy until the discovery of oil in the mid-19 teens off of Lake Maracaibo in the city of Maracaibo, the second largest city in Venezuela. And this discovery of oil created a massive economic boom from the 19-teens up until the 1970s. And the factors behind this boom outside of the oil discovery was that at this time, Venezuela featured relatively limited government, as well as an immigration system that attracted skilled European immigration from countries such as Italy, Portugal, and Spain. And also the country attracted a lot of immigrants from Colombia and other neighbors. Slide. And well, during this time period, ironically, Venezuela was under various military dictatorships, but even then, these dictatorships maintained a relatively hands-off approach to economic development. But this all came to an end in 1958, when Venezuela returned to democracy. And then in 1961, the country created a new constitution that gave the government extensive powers over economic affairs and just set the course for the installation of gradually more socialism. And this was consolidated in a pact called the Punto Fijo Pact between two political parties known as Acción Democrática, Democratic Action, and COPE, the Christian Democrats, that were both social democratic and believed in a very activist role for the state. So this return to democracy was a double-edged sword and sowed the seeds for the development of a relatively mild form of socialism. Then in the 1970s, the game started to change. As you see, picture there, Carlos Andrés Pérez, the president at the time, nationalized the oil industry and fundamentally changed the role of the economy and state. The Venezuelan state now was very powerful and could use oil revenues to engage in big welfare spending programs, subsidize industries, and just buy votes to consolidate its power, as well as other interventions like price controls, currency controls, restrictions on foreign investment, increased tariffs. In the 1970s, the Venezuelan government did everything possible to get involved in every facet of economic life. And eventually this whole party came to an end in the 1980s. In 1983, the Black Friday devaluation was the largest devaluation in Venezuelan history at that time, where the Bolivar, the Venezuelan currency, experienced a significant devaluation. And from that point forward, the country was just running fiscal deficits every year, was racking up debt, and the economy stagnated. And for the first time, Venezuela's economic growth not only slowed, but it was actually decreasing on net, and the result was unrest and growing poverty. The 90s, our friend Carlos Andrés Perez comes back promising to campaign on a platform that would return to the 1970s bonanza of spending. But once he came into office, he realized that Venezuela was not only bankrupt, but its economy was just way too intervened by the government. There was just too much government control. So he turns to the IMF, which recommended a series of reforms, which include privatizations, cuts in subsidies, and some small spending cuts here and there. The reforms were half measures at the end of the day, but they did have promising results. But we have to remember, Carlos Andrés Perez was the leader of a social democratic party, Acción Democrática, which was against all these reforms, and they did everything they can to roadblock him. And in the meantime, an upstart lieutenant colonel by the name of Hugo Chavez launches 2 unsuccessful coups in 1992, and he would be jailed and later pardoned. But this was an indicator of how unstable the country was at the time. And Carlos Andrés Perez actually would be impeached by his very own party in 1994. This was one of the final straws in the camel's back that completely demonstrated that the system was just in shambles. Then Chavez would be pardoned in the mid-1990s, and by that time, Venezuela's bipartisan system was completely in disarray, and for good reason. According to economist Charles Jones, Venezuela was a growth disaster from 1958 to 1998, meaning that during this time period, Venezuela was one of the only 2 countries in Latin America where its per capita GDP decreased on net. The only other country that occurred in was Nicaragua, a country that was mired by civil war and a socialist government. So essentially, the average Venezuelan in 1998, before Chavez came into power, was poorer than in 1958. And Chavez took advantage of this, launching in a very ambiguous campaign, ideologically campaigning against the corruption of the previous political order. But little did many people know that he was surrounding himself with numerous advisors and other socialist and communist agents. And the result was obvious once he came into power. Chavez embarked on a series of expropriations that completely eviscerated property rights in Venezuela. He implemented the infamous price controls and currency controls that are responsible for Venezuela's current shortage crisis. Also, there were many violations of civil liberties, such as media censorship through the persecution of dissenting media outlets, and the government even went as far as to buy out certain media outlets and staff them with regime-friendly journalists, and as well as the well-known devaluations of the Venezuelan bolivar and the central bank's activist monetary policy, which has completely turned the Venezuelan currency, the bolivar, into monopoly money. And that's only the tip of the iceberg, because the state oil company that I mentioned before that was nationalized in the 70s now became Chavez's personal piggy bank to use to buy off votes and consolidate his support. And people talk about the high oil prices as some like engine of economic growth. Really, it was just an engine for government growth. It just guaranteed political stability for his regime. There was no real wealth creation whatsoever. And this would show once Chavez died in 2013 and oil prices started to plummet. Nicolás Maduro really continued all of Chavez's policies: expropriations, price controls, devaluations, you name it. But this time, Maduro didn't have the luxury of high oil prices to maintain political order. So the result was there was political stability from within his government. There are now many factions of Venezuela's government that are actually against Maduro, and Venezuela basically, in certain parts of the country, is like Mad Max. It is a failed state, and there is massive crime and no law and order whatsoever. And you have also the scarcity and just the overall level of chaos. And the lessons learned here is that even like the small interventions, like small socialist states or social democracies, can metastasize into something really nasty if left unchecked. And it doesn't matter who's in charge, whether it's a PhD from Harvard or a bus driver like Maduro. The system will fail because socialism, by its nature, is a system that is based on flimsy economic principles. And this is a warning to the West that the social democracy experiment, especially in Europe, is going to come to an end once the money runs out. And whenever those systems collapse, a lot of people that have been completely brainwashed by public schooling and democracy worship, they're just going to ask for more government, and you're going to get situations that are not too dissimilar from Venezuela. We have to remember, even like great societies like Rome, they weren't built in one day, but they also didn't collapse in one day. So just leave it at that.